But here's our book. It's called Denial. It's about this increasing phenomenon. We're talking now more than a million children and young adults who are affected with autism. That's $1 trillion cost to our economy. And there are very few old people with autism, so this is a new phenomenon. And it's kind of obvious to most people who are close to the issue. But increasingly, we're running into a narrative, a pernicious narrative, that there's really nothing here, that this whole phenomenon is socially constructed, and there is no such thing as an autism epidemic. This new orthodoxy, this new idea that autism is ancient, and it's just a genetic variation, and it's just an underappreciated group of people that just need acceptance. But if you believe the reverse, which is the reality, that it's a recent phenomenon, that it's growing, and because of its growth in a very short period of time, it must be caused by something in the environment. Just to give you two examples of this, there are two books that motivated us to write this, and both books were widely praised and celebrated. This one is called Neurotribes by a fellow named Steve Silberman. Silberman's idea is that autism is nothing new, that we should celebrate autism. Autism is a wonderful thing. It's just a different way of being, and neurodiversity is a new form of tolerance that we should all exercise. The other book that came out shortly after Silberman's in 2017 was written by two ABC News reporters, John Donvan and Karen Zucker. It's a close cousin of Silberman's argument, and it's all, let's not worry about the problem. Let's not face reality. Let's just celebrate in an ABC News, 2-minute feature, a person of, autism is the disease of the week, and let's celebrate it and be happy about it. The original pioneers of the condition that we now call autism were two people, Leo Kanner, the guy on the upper left, and Hans Asperger, and I got this pretty cool. Leo Kanner wrote an article in 1943 in a journal called The Nervous Child, and it was entitled Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. It was written about 11 children, all born in the 1930s, all of whom came to Kanner in his clinic. He was at Johns Hopkins. He was the world's leading expert in child psychiatry. And no one had ever seen this phenomenon before Leo Kanner wrote about it. Hans Asperger was the director of a child clinic in Vienna, and within months of Kanner, who wrote in April of 1943, he wrote this was submitted in October of 1943, although it was actually published in 1944, but they were writing basically at the same time. He was writing in German about autistic psychopathy in children. Both of these guys are pretty normal. They just happened to be in a place and at a time where they observed a new population of children, and they wrote about it. And if autism didn't become an important problem, you would have never heard about them. And Kanner's article began with this sentence, and this is one of these sentences that I've tried to commit to memory. This is his 1943 article. Since 1938, he wrote, there have come to our attention a number of children whose condition differs so markedly and uniquely from anything reported heretofore. This was the man at Johns Hopkins, wrote the first textbook on child psychiatry. People from around the world brought their tough cases to him, from around the United States, certainly. And he began seeing he saw his first child in 1938. So just to put that in context, today, the U.S. population is about 325 million. In 1931, it was smaller, but it was still pretty big, about 124 million. So this was the catchment area for his practice, basically. He was the leading expert in the U.S. for child psychiatry. And if in 1931, if autism was truly ancient, and let's take the 1 in 68 number that now, if you go to the CDC, is the most commonly used number for the prevalence of autism, that would have said that if autism was constant prevalence, had always been with us at a rate of 1 in 68, that there would have been 1.8 million Americans in America, in Connor's day with autism before he wrote those words. Now, 1.8 million, that's a lot of people and a lot of children. And you would have thought that somebody might have mentioned it, but Connor wrote his article about 11 children as if it had never happened before. And so that's just absurd. I mean, so that, again, a reality check. So, so Connor's one marker. There's not a whisper of autism in the history of mankind before 1943. So it's a ridiculous notion. And by the way, that's an extraordinary claim. The notion that autism is ancient is an extraordinary claim, and it requires extraordinary proof. Leo Connor observed 11 children. The first one of them was the one he saw in 1938. So when he says since 1938, we've seen a number of children whose condition differ so markedly and uniquely. The first child with autism he saw, and remember, he was the world's expert in child psychiatry. He had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of children with various disorders, and he saw this case in 1938 that sparked a difference. His name, the case was a man named Donald Triplett. He's alive today. And whenever all of you go around, in the world and you hear this argument, you hear, oh, well, there's an autism increase. Well, oh, really? That's interesting. I hear that we're doing a better job diagnosing. You are hearing the propaganda. That is the false, pernicious idea that people in authority are spreading as a narrative, which is, oh, it doesn't really matter if there's an epidemic, because actually, if there was an epidemic, that creates a moral and social responsibility to find the cause. Before 1930, the rate of autism in the world was effectively 0. And then for a long time, they didn't even bother to measure because you just look at cases. And then when they began to measure it in the 70s, looking at populations born in the 50s and 60s, the rate in the US was very low, about 1 in 10,000, and steady for a long time. Then it began to inch up a little bit in the 70s, but then around 1990, the rate went vertical. You can look at it as the more severe form, which is close to what Connor described. PDD, autistic disorder, was long its name, and that rate has gone up, and that was the rate that was measured most in the past. And then they began, in 1994, they added Asperger's idea, and Asperger's syndrome was a lot like autism, except language is intact. And if you look at the CDC information, the rates were low back in the 80s and have increased sharply. And this is roughly the official CDC number. I've adjusted it somewhat, but when you hear 1 in 68, that's the number that you're hearing, and I'll come back to that. You know what? In civilization, doctors and scientists, well before Connor, have written about psychiatric conditions, about medical conditions. They've observed children. We have this vast literature of observation for centuries, really. And we ought to be able to find it if this hypothesis, if this proposal is true, that autism is ancient. And it shouldn't be like a subtle thing. It shouldn't be a thing where you look for a person here or a person there. No, you've got to find a giant that's missing from our collective memory. So we called it looking for Gulliver. And then you have to ask the question, before Connor, why wouldn't anyone have seen it? And weren't there any other qualified observers that might have a perspective on this problem? And in fact, there were. And in fact, they wrote about Connor's observations, and in the same way that Connor described autism, his contemporaries saw it the same way. Arne van Crevelen was a Dutch child psychiatrist, and he said he wrote in an article in 1952, less than a decade after Connor wrote. And he said, you know, I didn't know about this autism thing. It took nearly 9 years before the first case of early infantile autism, Connor's description, was published in Europe. His article was published in Europe. And being well aware of the publications, because there's a community of child psychiatrists around the world, I was able to arrive at the diagnosis when I happened upon the parents of my first autistic child. I noticed at the time that one could hardly ask for a more accurate informants than the parents. So it's both the qualified observers are the doctors and the parents. But Van Crevelen later said that each child that he saw is as much like those described by Connor as one raindrop is like another. So it's not subtle. It wasn't the sort of thing that you could overlook. Connor's description was stark, clear. Others who had it may have been in the field for decades, and when they saw a child that resembled Connor's cases, they said, wow, that's autism. That's what he's talking about. I've never seen that before. So there was a community of people. And Connor was a part of that community, and this was I mentioned his textbook. He wrote this textbook. It was called Child Psychiatry. Loving this thing. And it was published boosted by Adolph Meyer and Edwards Park, prominent people at Johns Hopkins, published in 1935. That's an important date. If you remember, he said he saw his first case in 1938. So he wrote this book and published it 3 years before Donald Triplett came to Hopkins. And this was a landmark. It was the first American textbook on child psychiatry. It's a big, thick book. It's 550 pages, and it's a catalog of every, problem of childhood: bedwetting, discipline problems, speech delay, things like childhood schizophrenia, even a condition I'll get to in a second called Heller-Wigand syndrome. But there's not a whisper of anything in this book that resembles autism. So Connor was a qualified observer. That's why autism found him. Because people with a new condition wanted to find the guy that wrote the book. There were two things that people wrote about back before autism was discovered. And they wrote about schizophrenia, which had a typical onset in adolescence, but there was often an earlier stage of onset of schizophrenia in some cases. And they wrote about this thing called dementia infantilis, both of which Connor described as paraergastic. And he wrote, paraergastic reactions are very infrequently seen to develop before the age of puberty. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the definition of autism is that its age of onset is by 36 months or earlier. Connor wrote about early infantile autism, which was present in the first months of life. And so they're saying, yeah, we can see regressions in children that are schizophrenic, but the earliest we ever see it is the 7th year of life. I emphasize the age of onset here because the age of onset is important. Schizophrenia is a very clear and tragic phenomenon. The age of onset is late. And why is that important? And I've always argued this, because the most dramatic growth in the human brain occurs after birth, in the first 2 and 3 years of life. And this is just a measure of that. If you measure growth in terms of milligrams per month of tissue or percentage of monthly growth, and you look at the first years of life, all that dramatic growth in the brain happens before 2 to 3 years of age. So the age of onset is critical. And if you're perturbing, if you imagine an environmental effect that's either happening in utero or happening in infancy, that's when the brain is most vulnerable. And this is Theodore Heller. In the early 20th century, everybody in the field knew about Theodore Heller. Heller wrote, during his stay in Vienna, Professor Wigand had examined one of my cases. I had previously told him about my observation and had suggested the name dementia infantilis for these cases. And you know what? He came and he agreed, he concurred completely with my observations, and he accepted the name. And the term was chosen to designate, this is very specific, dementia. Think dementia, like regression in your cognitive function, but not in old age, in infancy. So dementia infantilis. That's what they described. And so what we have with dementia infantilis, which is now often called Heller-Wigand syndrome, today we would call this, or they used to call this, childhood disintegrative disorder. It was in the diagnostic and statistical manual. It was well known, frequently observed, and rare. It was not the autism monster. So there were clear criteria. Everybody knew. There was a literature on it. A lot of people practicing child psychiatry all around the world. They knew what Heller's disease was. They knew what dementia infantilis was. They had tools. There have been a lot of people that have written about the intellectually disabled or mentally retarded. Most famously, here I go again, that's John Hayden Langdon Down. Famously, Down syndrome is named after him. So we've observed mental retardation and mental disability. Samuel Gridley Howe looked at intellectually disabled people in Massachusetts right before the Civil War. There were people writing in London in the late 19th century. William Ireland, Alfred Frank Treadgold wrote about amentia, mental deficiency, in the early 20th century. So there have been lots of authors, and they write these big, thick books about these populations, and they describe them in depth. They describe their symptoms, and you know what? And I'll give you some example. Here is William Ireland. He had chapters in his book, and here are all the categories he had for idiocy, which was genetic or microcephalic, small heads, hydrocephalic, preeclampsia, epileptic, paralytic, which is often associated with syphilis, inflammatory, the direct result of an encephalitis, cretinism, which is a loss of undernutrition with iodine. So all sorts of, there's nothing in there like autism. Haslam had described a number of cases who were resident in the Bedlam Asylum, and he had a lot of case histories. Most of them were in adults or teenagers, but he wrote about 2 children. And this is what he said. In the month of March 1979, a female child, 3¼ years old, was brought in. At 2½, she was inoculated for smallpox. Severe convulsions ushered in the disease, and delirium continued during its course. And from the termination of smallpox to the above date, the child continued in an insane state. This would meet the criteria for autism, certainly in terms of age of onset. Case 2, a boy nearly 7 years of age was admitted to the hospital. When a year old, he suffered much with the measles and afterward had a mild kind of inoculated smallpox. He became uncontrollable. So we do have 2 cases of regression before Hiller-Wigand syndrome. Interestingly, they're coupled with vaccination. Now, I don't want to get into the vaccine autism debate here, but we have a historical record, and these are the 2 most plausible cases I've seen for regressive autism before Lee O'Connor. It's not an epidemic, but it's clearly some kind of injury and an event, and Haslam wrote about them. People say absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. I generally agree with that. But there is a case that we can prove, we can demonstrate evidence of absence. In some circumstances, wrote this philosopher Copey, it can be safely assumed that if a certain event had occurred, evidence of it could be discovered by qualified investigators. That's why I like that phrase, qualified investigators. In such circumstances, it is perfectly reasonable to take the absence of proof of its occurrence as positive proof of its non-occurrence. There's a science now, there's a literature on the epidemiology of autism, and all these arguments are out there in the present day. One of them is this idea of diagnostic substitution, and again, it's this notion that we really just used to call it mental retardation, and now we're reclassifying. We're substituting the diagnosis of mental retardation or intellectual disability for autism. A good friend of mine, a terrific researcher, Cindy Nevison, has been driving some terrific analysis. I recommend her work. She lets me be co-author, and we wrote this together, which is a paper that was published just last year, basically saying no, diagnostic substitution. We have the data on intellectual disability, we have the data on autism, it's not true, and there are very few states that show any evidence of all of diagnostic substitution. In 31 states, the rate of increase of autism is much, much higher than any decline that there is in intellectual disability. CDC's backyard, they've done a number of studies, and you've got a constant rate of intellectual disability, and an explosion, a tenfold increase in autism rates, while other control conditions like cerebral palsy or vision impairment are pretty flat as well. All the data says there's something going on. There's a crisis here, and it's exploded since 1990, and everything else is constant. And it's not substituting for anything. It's a whole new generation of kids. So we're in denial, and the problem is that we made a big mistake. We've got this, clearly something happened. It happened around 1990. We clearly have responsibility to do it, and you know what? Someone did something wrong. And when we err as a society on that scale, this is one of my favorite philosophers, Karl Popper. It's very hard to learn from very big mistakes. And we've made a big mistake, and we've got a lot of people that are invested in denial. And there's one very clear thing that's going on, which is there's money. You know, and you haven't noticed much on vaccines here. I've written about vaccines, talked about vaccines, been in movies on vaccines. And there's a profit web that supports this industry. And you know what? If part of the mistake, I think it's a big part, it's not the only part, but if part of the mistake we've made as a society is that we've over-vaccinated a generation of children, and this, by the way, the vaccine manufacturing business is a big business. Right at the heart of it is Big Pharma. And I put my little thing on there if it wouldn't shut off the whole slide. The vaccine business is a big industry. There are 4 big manufacturers, almost nobody else. $25 billion in revenue, probably a 30-35% profit margin on that, just as rich as the drug business. And so they're right in the heart of it. They deal with HHS and the research community. There's a lot of money that goes, not huge amounts that goes into vaccine research, but NIH patents and licenses their vaccine technology to companies like Merck. The Gardasil vaccine was an invention of NIH, and Merck makes money off of it. Vaccines are administered, shipped to pediatricians. That's a $19 billion business. And the main reason young families go to the doctor is for a well baby visit. And so a huge chunk of pediatric revenue comes from the vaccine administration process. It's not the vaccine itself. They'll say, oh no, we make no money on vaccines. No, you don't mark up the vaccines themselves. The drug companies make all the money on the vaccines. But you make money as a doctor, as a pediatrician, on the well baby visit. That's the bulk of your, of your revenue. I wish I knew how much, but it's a huge chunk. So there's and that's an army of people, a whole community of lovely human beings, doctors, pediatricians that want to help children, that went into medicine to help children. And you know what? They're not. They're the administration, their economic function is the administration of vaccines today. They do relatively little, helping sick children. So that's a whole constituency, an economic constituency for this problem. You have, an NIH funds and gives grants to academia, so the universities are part of this. It's hard to know how much, vaccine money is spent in universities. I don't have that number, but it's something. There's something like $21 billion in medical science funding, so they're all part of this medical industrial complex. So you have academics, you have the NIH, you have pharma companies, you have Silicon Valley because they want part of this action too. There are vaccine startups. There's a whole life sciences startup industry that's, circulates around San Francisco and Silicon Valley. They are all, so you have Wired Magazine. It's no accident that Steve Silberman came to the denial position from Wired Magazine because Silicon Valley is in life sciences too. And they want every possible therapy to explore. So there's money there. And then you know what? The biggest influence is, the networks. They make $3.5 billion off of drug advertising. And you know where that goes? It's the evening news. And we just took, Dan and I, actually Dan's husband, Mark Millett, sat and taped the evening news programs for a week a year ago. And we just went through and counted all the ads. And they're ads for prescription drugs or over the counter. And in every case, in every network, close to half of the advertisement count is drug company ads. You get the news eventually, that the advertisers pay for. And the drug companies are paying for the evening news. So no surprise, we don't get, what we get as a narrative is, Andy Wakefield is evil, he lied about the autism vaccine link, the vaccine link has been denied, and everybody should just go to the doctor and get their shots. We have this whole tsunami of young autistic people, and there weren't many adults. There didn't used to be. We don't have senior citizens with autism, maybe 1,000 or two in the population. But we have this impending wave of affected people, disabled people entering our services system, and it's a system that is not prepared for it. And it's just started to deal with it. When these kids are in their 50s and 60s, their parents are going to die. Who's going to take care of them? And so I say to you, this is, better diagnosing is not this sort of benign hypothesis. It's a pernicious, wrong, damaging, irresponsible hypothesis. So that's the message. Denial is important. The autism problem is a national emergency. We're not treating that like we should, and it's all of our collective responsibility to wake up our families, our communities, our legislators. Thanks to Dan. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much.